Little indication of how long this one will last. Hopefully. Ford stared at Arthur, who began to think that perhaps he did want to go to the Horse and Groom after all. "But what about my house?" he asked plaintively. Ford looked across to Mr. Prosser, and suddenly a wicked thought struck him. "He wants to knock your house down." "Yes, and he wants to build—" "And he can't because you're lying in front of his bulldozer." "Yes, and—" "I'm sure we can come to some arrangement," said Ford. "Excuse me," he shouted. Mr. Prosser, who was arguing with a spokesman for the bulldozer drivers about whether or not Arthur Dent constituted a mental health hazard and how much they should get paid if he did, looked around. He was surprised and slightly alarmed to see that Arthur Dent had company. "Yes, hello?" he called. "Has Mr. Dent come to his senses yet?" "Can we, for the moment," called Ford, "assume that he hasn't?" "Well," sighed Mr. Prosser. "And can we also assume," said Ford, "that he's going to be staying here all day?" So all your men are going to be standing around all day doing nothing?" Could be. "Well, if you're resigned to doing nothing anyway, you don't actually need him to lie here all the time, do you?" "What?" "You don't," said Ford patiently, "actually need him here." Mr. Prosser thought about this. "Well, no, not as such," he said. "Not exactly need." Mr. Prosser was worried. He thought that one of them wasn't making a lot of sense. Ford said, "So if you'd just like to take it as read that he's actually here, then he and I could slip off down to the pub for half an hour. How does that sound?" Mr. Prosser thought it sounded perfectly potty. "That sounds perfectly reasonable," he said in a reassuring tone of voice, wondering who he was trying to reassure. "And if you want to pop off for a quick one later on," said Ford, "we can always cover for you in return." "Thank you very much," said Mr. Prosser, who no longer knew how to play this at all. "Thank you very much. Yes, that's very kind." He frowned. He then smiled, then tried to do both at once. Failed, grasped hold of his fur hat and rolled it fitfully about the top of his head. He could only assume that he had just won. "So," continued Ford Prefect, "if you would just like to come over here and lie down." "What?" said Mr. Prosser. "I'm sorry," said Ford. "Perhaps I hadn't made myself clear. Somebody's got to lie in front of the bulldozers, haven't they? Or there won't be anything to stop them from driving into Mr. Dent's house, will there?" "What?" said Mr. Prosser again. "It's very simple," said Ford. "My client, Mr. Dent, says that he will stop lying here in the mud on the sole condition that you come over and take over for him." "What are you talking about?" said Ford, but Ford nudged him with his shoe to be quiet. "You want me," said Mr. Prosser, spelling out this new thought to himself, "to come and lie there?" "Yes." "In front of the bulldozer?" "Yes." "Instead of Mr. Dent?" "Yes." "In the mud." "In, as you say, the mud." As soon as Mr. Prosser realized that he was substantially the loser after all, it was as if a great weight lifted itself off his shoulders, and that it was more like the world as he knew it. He sighed. "In return for which you will take Mr. Dent down to the pub." "That's it," said Ford. "That's it exactly." Mr. Prosser took a few nervous steps and stopped. "Promise?" he said. "Promise," said Ford, and he turned to Arthur. "Come on," he said. "Get up and let the man lie down." Arthur stood up, feeling as if he was in a dream. Ford beckoned to Mr. Prosser, who sadly, awkwardly, sat down in the mud. He felt that his whole life was some kind of dream. He sometimes wondered whose it was and whether they were enjoying it. The mud folded itself around his bottom and in his arms and oozed into his shoes. Ford looked at him severely. "And no sneaky knocking down Mr. Dent's house while he's away, all right," he said. "The mere thought," growled Mr. Prosser. "Hadn't even begun to speculate," he continued, settling himself back, "about the merest possibility of crossing my mind." He saw the bulldozer driver's union representative approaching and let his head sink back and closed his eyes. He was trying to marshal his arguments for proving that he did not now constitute a mental health hazard himself. He was far from certain about this. His mind seemed to be full of noise, horses, smoke, and the stench of blood. This always happened to him when he felt miserable or put on upon, and he had never been able to explain it to himself. In a high dimension of which we know nothing, the mighty Khan bellowed with rage, but Mr. Prosser only trembled slightly and whimpered. He began to feel little pricks of water behind his eyelids, bureaucratic cock-ups, angry men lying in mud, indecipherable strangers handing out inexplicable humiliations, and an unidentified army of horsemen laughing at him in his head. What a day. What a day. Ford Prefect knew that it didn't matter a pair of dingo's kidneys whether Arthur's house got knocked down or not. Arthur remained very worried. "But can we trust him?" he said. "Myself, I trust him to the end of the earth," said Ford. "Oh, yes?" said Arthur. "And how far's that?" "About 12 minutes away," said Ford. "Come on, I need a drink."